Over a year ago, Mary, I was up here for some function of sorts, and Mary asked me if I'd be willing to speak and do a little slide presentation. I thought, sure, no problem. I've done many talks on Old Bridgewater, and it's always been a lot of fun, but this one presented some real challenges. Being a neighbor of West Bridgewater, I worked as building inspector. I worked in town on and off for a couple of years part-time, filling in between different building inspectors. So I got a pretty good idea of the differences between the two towns. But it really didn't come to light until I started putting this stuff together. I'm by no means an expert on West Bridgewater history. I'm by no means an expert on Bridgewater history. I'm a student of history, and I hope to learn. So if anybody has something to bring forward that I don't mention, I'm more than happy to listen to any of it. And I'm always open to corrections or whatever. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about West Bridgewater and some of the things that kind of general things, but I think should be emphasized. So we will start. There it is. Okay. Like I said, I'm always open to comments. This is my name, my email address up there, and if you ever want to call me, one of my part-time jobs, when I retired, I should have retired for everything, but I didn't. So I am still the Sealer of Weights and Measures for the town of West Bridgewater, and I thought it was pretty good, so I'm also the Sealer of Weights and Measures for West Bridgewater, East Bridgewater, and Halifax. So if you ever want to find me with a phone number, just pull up to a gas pump, and my number is right there on the sticker. And that'll take you through the Bridgewater Building Inspector's office, but it'll go directly to my cell phone. So you can get a hold of me anytime, and I'm always open to comments and so forth. A couple books that I really like about Bridgewater history, and the way they're done, it's kind of interesting. Mayflower Papers by Nathaniel Philbrick. Now, he did the book, The Mayflower, but all of the extra information that he didn't put in the book, The Mayflower, is in the Mayflower Papers. So there's a lot of really neat personal stories that he came across that he didn't put in the book. And I think one of the funniest ones is just after they got the meeting house erected in the spring of 1621, dire conditions, people were dying left and right. They were down to probably 15 men who could carry a firearm, and they were at the fort, or the only building they had, and they noticed many Indians on the opposite ridge. Now, if you're familiar with Jenny Grist Mill Park, the brook that runs through Plymouth, as you're facing the ocean, on the left-hand side on the hill, up on Fort Hill, behind the church where the graveyard is, that's where the meeting house was, on that hill. And then you look to your right, and today it's all houses. But that's the slope where they saw the Indians. So Samoset was there at the time, and he said, let me go see what they want. This is the first encounter they had with numerous Indians, and they were very leery because they're down to about 15 men that can hold a rifle. So they had a number of bodies around that they couldn't bury, so they propped them up against trees and put muskets in their hands and so forth. So Samoset went over and spoke to the Indians, and then eventually he comes back, and as he's coming back, the Indians dissipate. They leave. It's like, whoa, what did you tell them? And he said, well, you see the barrel over there, you keep the powder outside of the fort, so in case there's an explosion and everything, you're not going to lose your dwelling. He said, I told them that in that barrel you had the plague that had killed the majority of the Indians in the area for the 2 years before. They were more afraid of the plague. They knew what a weapon of mass destruction that was than the 15 men with muskets. So for that reason, they left. And eventually they came back one at a time. But the pictures you see of the first Thanksgiving with women and children around and so forth, the Indians were still very skeptical of the white man, so only the braves came back and enjoyed dinner with them. But it's stories like that. And Philbrook, he's written a number of books. I'm reading one now about Washington and his and Benedict Arnold and so forth, and just the stories that he brings up are just phenomenal. And you know, it's historical fiction. I'm sure he doesn't have any personal accounts of the exact words that were given and everything, but Philbrook's a great guy, I think. Governor William Bradford wrote extensively on the early years of Plymouth and the explorations up into this area, the Bridgewater area, their negotiations with Massasoit and so forth. Another man who's written a lot on Bridgewater, and it's just phenomenal. I was happy to see one of his books over here in the rack, Dr. Ben Spence. He used to visit with our historical commission many times. And Ben's a retired professor from Bridgewater Bridgewater University. And he has written 10 essays. Now, we all remember what an essay was like when we were in high school. Teacher said, write an essay, page or two, and we struggled through that. Well, Ben's essays are anywhere from 90 to 140 pages. And the detail in his essays, the research that this guy has put into this stuff, is just phenomenal. And and they're all free. They're online. I'm not trying to destroy the sales for the OBHS because they have one of his books over there. But if you go on Bridgewater State University, their virtual commons, all of his books are there. I hope he continues with other writings, but he's getting up in years, and we're grateful for what he's done. But it's some really neat stuff. Images of America, the West Bridgewater book. It's a really neat one. I did one on Bridgewater, but the West Bridgewater one was a big help in preparing for this one. And then there's another book. It has a bright blue and yellow cover on it, the Old Bridgewater Tercentenary. That was done in 1956, I believe. I've enjoyed reading it, and I got some good things out of it, but I was talking with Margaret Alexander. She was like the town historian in East Bridgewater, if any of you knew her, a tremendous lady. And she never had a lot of faith in the book. There's too many errors in it. So, as with any history book, you know, take things with a grain of salt to a certain extent, and always look for a second confirmation of specific facts. So, to put things in perspective, we don't go backwards, we go forward. The Giza Pyramid, we think of this as being something ancient. Well, the Native Americans Native Americans in this area, that pyramid was 2500 BC. Native Americans were here in this area in force, thousands of them. I've read different numbers, 100,000, 55,000, somewhere in that area, in New England, and they were all over the place. 5,000 to 10,000 years, or maybe longer than that, before. So we're only talking about a couple hundred years today. Native Americans were here thousands and thousands of years before. They were excellent stewards of the land. They say that the first explorers that were here, the first people that came through, the forests were unlike anything we have today, the wooded areas. They say you could run a horse at full speed through any forest in any direction because the Native Americans kept the growth down for hunting purposes and so forth, for forest fire purposes and so forth. That's one of the biggest problems we have in the western part of the country now. When they have a forest fire, regulations have prevented people from going in and removing the debris. Well, the Native Americans knew how dangerous this stuff was to leave in the forest. They had no fire departments. You have a lightning strike, starts a forest fire, they could lose everything. You could lose the whole half of the state if things weren't properly maintained. So the Native Americans, the tribes in this area, that were in 1600. But keep in mind that they were decimated by the time the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, or the early explorations in this area, because of the plague. Some sort of illness came to this part of the country in the couple of years preceding 1620. They're not sure exactly, 1617, 1618, and it killed anywhere from 70 to 80% of the Native American population. Whether it was just a flu or it was something, smallpox or whatever, they don't know. But it decimated the Native Americans, because in Bradford's book and Philbrick's book, they all talk about the early explorers coming through here and finding Indian settlements all over the place, abandoned, and with skeletons laying on the beds, the cots that they had, and so forth. The disease went through so fast they didn't even have time to bury their dead. So it changed the face of the Native Americans in New England. Okay, it's this one. All right. The Wampanoags were the major tribe in the area, and they were all the branches of the Wampanoags. When the Pilgrims landed out on Martha's Vineyard, they had an encounter with the Nauset Indians. They got caught robbing graves. They didn't know that they were robbing graves. They found mounds of, they thought there might have been buried supplies of corn and so forth. Some were, but some were actual graves. But one of the graves they dug up wasn't an Indian in it. It was a man with red hair. So they're not sure exactly if he was a part of a fishing party. The English, the French, the Dutch had been visiting this area for many, many years, and for fishing purposes. They'd come and they would harvest cod and salt it down and bring it back to England, a very valuable commodity in England. So they had been here for a good 30 or 40 years before the Pilgrims were here. So they're not the first white people to be in the area. Bridgewater was settled, officially settled in 1656. But prior to that, within the first 2 years of the Pilgrims being here, parties came up into this area and they explored. And one of the, as we've seen growth today in our area, you know that wherever the train goes or wherever the railroad goes, growth follows it. Well, it was the same way back in the early 1600s. One of the big things in Bridgewater was, colonial Bridgewater, was farmland, flat land down in Plymouth. You get a lot of hilly land, you get a lot of sandy soils and so forth. But Bridgewater had excellent soils because of the rivers in the area. And you can see Bridgewater located right there. Now, obviously, Bridgewater is, really Bridgewater? Nah, come on, I don't want to go that way. Well, let's try this one. Right there. Okay. This is basically South Parish, or South Bridgewater right now. But the town of West Bridgewater that we're in right now is right in this area. But you can see that it's in the middle of all of these rivers and streams. And rivers and streams provided water power, and it provided transportation. And as you have the War Memorial Park, let's see, where are we? We're right over there. That was a major attraction to the settlement of early Bridgewater because of the potential for water power. And water power was needed for basic commodities such as grinding grain and tanning hides and making iron and so forth. Now, what did they needed for? This was the money, the trade, the commodities that were traded for the early town of Bridgewater. Now, the negotiations for Bridgewater had started not in 1656, but they started talking to the Indians in the 1630s and the 1640s, because the Indians were slowly running out of things to trade for all of these things. They love to get their hands on knives and metal implements and fabrics and so forth. And these are all things that the Indians saw a great value for, but they couldn't produce them. So they would trade hides, pelts and so forth for beaver and deer and so forth, because these were very valuable to ship back to England for to repay the debt to the people who sent them over here to start with. So as time went on, the Indians no longer had beaver was getting scarce, and the other animals were getting scarce. So all they had left that the colonists wanted was land. Well, Indians had really no concept of ownership of land. They didn't know, they started talking about, well, we want a 5-mile radius or a 6-mile radius and so forth of a certain point, a Sachem Rock, or the fish weir down by the Carver Cotton Gin and so forth. But the Indians had no concept of how far miles was, or land ownership. You want to come and live near in our part of the state? No problem. Sure, give us some knives and so forth, and some other things, and no problem. But it led to problems because the legislature, the king's offices in Boston, didn't want anybody just negotiating with the Indians. So after a couple tries, they finally got it right in 1656, and King Charles allowed them to colonize the area, to officially come in. And they had the original grants of land were just as we have land today. You can't put up a house out in the woods. You need house frontage. You need street frontage on a particular road. Well, King Charles saw the value of having frontage on a stream. So that's why all the original land grants consisted of so many feet along the water and then so many acres inland. So they were all around the streams. And Reverend Keith's house, 1662. I had 1668 written down. Oh well. But obviously one of the early homes in the area, there is a house in Bridgewater that I did a lot of work on years ago, and that was the Alden House. Basically the same type of construction as the Keith house. But it was typical of houses in the area. And if you go down to Plymouth, you'll see many of these, and they've been expanded over the years. But this was the colonial center of Bridgewater, right here where the park is. And Howard Street, they say the original meeting house was somewhere in that area back there, but nobody has ever found exactly where it was. Let's see, what else did I have? Another thing that I used to talk to the kids about was, okay, people were living here from 1656. Who has ever seen a gravestone in this area that goes back to somebody dying before 1700? It's pretty rare. So where were people buried? When the shopping center was put in, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, I can remember the neighborhood opposition to it. It was tremendous. And they said that some of the early test pits they did over there, they came across some bones and some jewelry. Well, nobody was ever able to put their hands on it and say, okay, you're digging in a graveyard, but for a long time they termed that the Graveside Mall, who were just trying to further discourage the development of it. But it went forward and so forth. But the early gravestones in Bridgewater, the early grave sites, I used to tell the kids, and when I used to do this at the elementary schools, be careful when you're digging in your backyard, because you never know what you're going to find. Let's see. Going on River Street, Keith House, okay. Growth and expansion, 1766, 1776. They had a tremendous debt that they had to pay back to England. And all of the things that they had to provide were lumber for building ships and so forth. Charcoal was a very big commodity. They needed charcoal for making iron, both here in West Bridgewater and in England. So charcoal was a big commodity that they needed. And charcoal pits were made in many places. I'm going to show you one in a minute. Iron, bricks. I couldn't find any location of brickyards in West Bridgewater. Does anybody know of a brickyard, early brickyard in West Bridgewater? Yes, East Bridgewater I know. Yes.
I've been told that by Mr. Lawrence Conant, that there were brickyards on the piece of property just to the south of Reynolds Landing. I don't know how old, you have to check.
Yeah. Well, they say the last remaining brickyard in Bridgewater and in New England is Stiles and Hart down off of Titicut Street, Cook Street in South Parish. But the history of that is they say that they have found remains on the site that indicated that had been a brickyard in the 1700s. So bricks were a very valuable commodity. Matter of fact, when the name of the fort off of the Florida Keys, there's a big fort down there. It's at the end. Fort Jefferson. Thank you. When they were doing some restoration work down there, they wanted New England brick, and they came up and they spoke to the owners of Stiles and Hart. They went down, looked at the brick that they had to make, and they made thousands of brick for Fort Jefferson for the restoration down there. One of the advantages of brick in this area over other parts of the country is the high sand content. Because when you make brick, you make brick out of what you take out of the ground. You can't waste time mixing a certain amount of sand with a certain amount of clay. So your bricks are made specifically from the soil that you take out. There was a time when I served on the Conservation Commission in Bridgewater, and the state had come down on them big time for their mining practices, because they had a number of what they call clay pits around the property, big piece of land, where they had gone in over the last 100 years and so forth and scraped off 12 feet of clay. I believe it's 1 foot of clay, 1 acre in size yields 1 million brick. So I said, well, I got to know him pretty well. I said, Lincoln, what are you going to do when you run out of clay? He said, we just got to go deeper. Because the state came in and told him, okay, yeah, that was a clay pit 30 years ago, where you went in and you didn't have a machine big enough to scrape the clay out to go any deeper, so you moved over there. Well, in the meantime, that clay pit has since filled in with water, vegetation and so forth. Now that's wetlands. You can't go back into that clay pit and take any more water, take any more clay out of there. So they got a big machine, and they just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper down there. And so that's the history, the future of bricks in New England. And then a couple of years ago, I was sitting on a school building committee, and the contractor was told, you've got to use Bridgewater brick or Stiles and Hart brick. And they got all upset because the brick is so good, it's so hard that a mason cannot lay a lot of brick over a long stretch. What happens is that the brick is so hard it doesn't absorb the water from the mortar very fast. So they're limited in how high they can come up because the mortar isn't going to set up in a day. And if the mortar doesn't set up fast, the wall will fall over before the mason leaves, before he goes home. So they have to work in longer sections. But that's just a characteristic of Bridgewater brick. That's why they wanted it down at Fort Jefferson, because it's a very hard brick. And it's also used extensively in City Hall in Boston. All the pavers you see in City Hall are all Bridgewater brick because of the hard sand and low water absorption characteristics of it. Okay, so brick. Let's see. Agriculture. Agriculture was mainly to support themselves. Just for survival. Now, all of these things needed water power. West Bridgewater, I could only find 2 major sites of water power. One is up off of Crescent Street and the other one here. You need height in order to get water power. West Bridgewater is fairly flat, whereas South Parish, Bridgewater, it goes from up at the nip in that area, and the elevations up in that area are somewhere to 150 to 160 feet above sea level. And when the river finally leaves Bridgewater down on the Middleborough-Rainham line, it's down to about 36 feet. So you've got a lot of vertical decline. And as you have vertical decline, you have a chance to build dams with a lot of headwater or height. The dam that you see in the town park down here, 5 or 6 feet. Up at the Canoe Club, you got another 5 or 6 feet up there. But the dam in Bridgewater at the Ironworks is about 12 feet. And further downstream, you had, they call it the paper mill district, you had good 8 or 10 feet of headwater down there. And this means that you can dam up a tremendous amount of water. The water flowage rights for the Ironworks in Bridgewater are over 400 acres. So they have the right to flood 400 acres. That dam is in the process of being removed. The engineering is being done now, and that dam is coming out because what they're trying to do is make it easier for fish to get up into the nip. And I think it's only a matter of time before you see some changes with the dam in West Bridgewater, because that will be the last obstruction, the last dam on the Taunton River, all the way from Fall River up to the Hockomock Swamp. So it's only a matter of time, I think, before you see that dam coming out also. Done enough talking on that. Okay, just the dam sites in Bridgewater. I know we're in West Bridgewater, but just to show you the numerous sites in Bridgewater, all of those blue spots, the Ironworks up here, Carver's Pond, and so forth, Skeeter Mill Pond. There are a couple sawmills over here. Another major ironworks, the southernmost ironworks in colonial Bridgewater, it goes back to 1709 as Sturtevant's Pond. And this is something that you could look up sometime. Paul Revere came to Bridgewater to study cannon making, and where he went to was right here at Sturtevant's Pond. They had a revolutionary process for casting cannon. Normally, it was taking everybody else about a month to cast a cannon and get it online. They had a process down there, it took 3 days. So it was worth, the colonial legislature sent Revere down. What are they doing down there? Let's go take a look. And it was so good that they stationed guards down here that should the British come in, we didn't want them to steal the secrets on casting this cannon. So they were to burn everything. And then after they continued producing until the 1780s, and finally it closed down. But the key to the production was they had a chance to back up a lot of water, a lot more than what you could do over here at the town park. Many industries started here in the town park, most notably the Ames family, and other operations took place down here, sawmills and grist mills and so forth, fulling mills. But they didn't have a lot of water as compared to what they had in South Parish. And West Bridgewater, okay, it's this one. Yep. Okay, you can see this is West Bridgewater, the center of town. The War Memorial Park is right in this area. And then there was another one up on Crescent Street. There was another dam up here that started out with the Ames family. Now, these were sufficient to get the Ames empire going, but they needed more water, they needed more power, so they ended up moving up to Easton. And I believe these continued on for probably 100 more years afterwards as small mills, but they never really made it because they didn't have a lot of water flowage. One thing interesting about these maps, now this is about 1830 in West Bridgewater, but notice you see trees. Trees are usually in the wetlands area. Every other area, the trees are gone. It's all open farmland. West Bridgewater, or West Parish, was mainly an agricultural community, and these are all fields. I think it's kind of neat, and people talk about global warming and everything and cutting down trees. Well, there were very few trees back then, 200 years ago. They were all gone for two reasons. One, they used the wood for building, for charcoal, for other purposes. But number two, trees were ornamental, the ones that were left standing, or they were in the swamp and you couldn't get them out until the swamp froze in the wintertime, and then you go in and cut them down for making charcoal. But imagine, what would you do? You don't have the Indians around to clean the forests anymore, so now you've got a tremendous amount of wood growing around here, and you get a forest fire, you're going to lose everything. So it was for fire protection. There was a reason to keep these fields open. You needed it for production, agricultural production, but you also there was no value in just letting land go back to forest. And the trade that was going back to England from the products, we were exporting the iron, charcoal, and lumber, going back to Europe, and they were turning it into textiles, rum, manufactured goods, and so forth, to Africa. And then the slave business was very big. So they would bring slaves back to America, to the West Indies and so forth. And in reading Philbrook's book about Washington and Hamilton, they stressed that the British were more concerned about the lack of trade from the Caribbean than they were from America, from North America. So when the French got into the war, supporting the colonies, then they pulled out of Boston. They didn't pull out of Boston because they thought we had more guns than them. We had more men than them. They pulled out of Philadelphia, and they ended up in New York, and eventually they pulled out of New York. And it wasn't because we won a lot of battles, because we didn't during the Revolution. It was because they were afraid that the French and the Spanish were going to take away their sugar trade from the Caribbean. So we won by a war of attrition. Local products for export: lumber, charcoal, iron ingots, bricks, and fur. Now, iron ingots, the Ames family was known for their iron down here. The Ames family was known for their iron up on Crescent Street. Where were they getting the iron from? They were getting it from bog ore, and bog ore looks like rusty sand. And how much did you need to make iron? If you dug 100 pounds of bog ore, you would get 1 pound of iron out of it. And 1 pound of iron is smaller than a baseball. So you can imagine moving 100 pounds of ore and getting so little out of it. And to get that iron out of the ore, you had to consume, I think it was 7 cord of wood turned into charcoal to get that 1 pound of iron. So they consumed a tremendous amount of wood and charcoal. Wood in the beginning, hand-hewn logs. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. If you get down to Plymouth, you'll see them doing the same thing. And then as time went on, in Philbrook's book, he talks about saw pits and 2 men cutting boards out of a log. And then this is a vertical sawmill, which I'm sure there was one of these down in the town park. If you ever get a chance to get up to Sturbridge Village, they have a vertical sawmill up there. And to see that thing in operation, it's alive, because that building, the whole building is moving, it's fluid, as that saw blade is going up and down in that log. And if you ever get into an old house that they're restoring, you can kind of date things a little bit by looking at the saw marks in the timbers, or maybe in some of your homes if you own an older home. Vertical sawmills were the common way of cutting timbers and boards and so forth up until about 1830, 1840, and then they went to circular saws. So boards cut with a vertical sawmill will have straight lines in the saw grooves in the boards, whereas your circular saw will leave obviously circular patterns. Charcoal. Probably about 20 years ago, somebody called me up and they said, come on, we got something in the woods I want you to look at. So it was in the fall, after all the leaves had come off the trees. It was down off of Cherry Street in Bridgewater. And there was in the forest, you could see circles, probably about 40 or 50 feet in diameter, raised up about so high. And I said, what is this, alien spacecraft have been landing, or what's going on here? But those were charcoal pits. And this is how charcoal is made. Men in the wintertime, obviously the water power is limited, so the foundries couldn't run. You couldn't grind corn and so forth because everything was frozen. You couldn't dig bog ore, so men went into the woods to make charcoal. And they would cut logs and stack them up 4 6-foot lengths, stack them up like that in a pit, and then they would cover it with mud and leaves and make an airtight seal over the whole thing. They leave a little pathway. This doesn't show it, but maybe it's where it says vent there. They would leave a little pathway that you could get inside of there and light it on fire. And this pile of logs would burn for 2 to 3 weeks. And it was up to the person tending the fire to make sure that it smoldered. It didn't really burn. There was no flame. It just kind of glowed inside. And there was an art to it, controlling how much air went in. And they would watch it, and then eventually, when it would collapse as it came down, as all the moisture was burned out of the wood, and it was all turned into charcoal. And then they'd strip the earth and leaves off of it and recover the charcoal from it. Charcoal is needed to make iron because you can't burn wood and get a fire hot enough to melt iron. To melt iron, to refine the bog ore, you needed about 2,500 degrees, and that's why you needed charcoal. So charcoal was used extensively, and it was also used extensively to make gunpowder. So it had a tremendous value to England. So this was a big, big industry. So if you're ever walking through flat areas in virgin forest or forest that hasn't been disturbed recently, you will see these circles. Bricks, another one. Bricks making was a seasonal business. They could not dig clay in the springtime. In the wintertime, they could only dig it in the spring. And then the bricks would be formed up in wooden molds and laid out in the sun to dry. They'd have to dry for about 2 weeks in the sun, and then they'd be baked. But obviously, if it rained, it would take longer for the bricks to set up. And then you put them in big kilns built on the site, similar to that. And the bricks would be fired up and burned. And it would take about a week. And you can see the amount of wood that was consumed. So that was another big use of wood in the area. People were cutting wood everywhere. What did the ironworks here at the town park look like? Probably something like this, maybe not quite as big. This is Saugus. If you ever get up there, it's free. It's run by the National Park Service. You can go in there. It was restored by a grant from the Ford Foundation and American Iron and Steel Institute in the 1940s, I believe. Tremendous site if you're interested in what actually went on in a colonial furnace. So you can go up there. They did do a couple loads of iron just to prove that it did work, but it hasn't run. They run the water wheels occasionally, but they don't do it on a regular basis. This is a little bit better drawing to show you what the kiln looked like. They would, let's see, They would take the wheelbarrows full of iron ore and charcoal and dump them in the top, and it'd be layer after layer. And then eventually, there's a set of bellows. There's a set of bellows right here run by the water wheel, and it would blow air in there, and it would cause the fire to get very hot, and then the iron would come out over here and form into iron ingots. But when that was running, it would run 24/7, say for about a month. So they had to have tremendous supplies of wood and ore and charcoal, and the other ingredient was limestone. Well, there were no natural limestone deposits in the area, so they used a lot of clamshells. And the clamshells were used to refine the iron, cause the impurities to go to the surface. Now you can imagine how hard it was to get limestone clamshells in West Bridgewater. So the iron industry never really made it in this part of the state until after the advent of the railroad. When the railroad came through, it brought in all the raw materials, and it made it much easier to make iron in the area. This is what the furnace looks like inside. The men at the top pouring iron, pouring the raw materials in here, coming down below, the water wheel. And you've heard of iron pigs. Well, this is supposed to look like a mother pig with all the little pigs in for lunch. So that's where pig iron comes from. And you'd end up with these blocks of crude iron, which would have to be refined, and they were refined by, well, that's just one little one right there. Now, let's do the big one. Okay, this is a heavy forge. They'd have to take those bars of iron, heat them up again red hot, and over in the town park, there is a base for a forge. There's a big block of iron that's over by the, as you just come in, by the grindstones that are there. And that's what it was used for. You had a trip hammer that was run by water power. This shaft has the cogs on it that would lift up the hammer and then drop it down on the pieces of red hot iron. And they would keep hammering this and hammering it, and when it cooled off, they'd put it back in the furnace, get it red hot again, bring it out, and keep pounding it until they got all the little pockets of carbon out of the iron. And it made it strong enough to be used for all sorts of things that they wanted to produce. One of the things that I find interesting in looking at history is streets and how they changed, how they've evolved over the years. I think, and in street names, I've always wanted to go back and put together a list of names of streets and so forth, and how they relate to the people who developed the street, or in the very beginning, in South Parish, or coming through this area, Bedford Street. There is no Bedford. No, it's North Main and South Main. Yeah. Okay. So Bedford Street is roughly Route 18. It goes through East Bridgewater, down through Bridgewater, and down through Middleborough, and it's the road to New Bedford. Route 18 was the longest straight road laid out in New England, and it was never completed until the 1930s through the WPA. And through West Bridgewater, on this map of West Bridgewater, I think it's neat, looking it over, you can see West Bridgewater Center right here, and you can see there was no road connecting West Bridgewater Center to, this is roughly West Center Street, and this is where the high school complex and the library and the senior center and everything is. But there was no road from the center to here originally, and it was just all field. Another place they straightened out, up here, Old Main Street, North Main Street. You can see the turn, the old Dairy Queen, I don't know what it is now, but right here, but how they've straightened out the road over the years. And then down here, the road going to Bridgewater came through the center of town, but it did not go straight through. It went down Ash Street. And you can see it's been somebody penciled it in. And Ash Street comes down in this area because there was a large section of swamp in this area, and it was easier to go down Ash Street and get across than it was to build a bridge through the swamp. There's an interesting street in Bridgewater, in West Bridgewater, Matfield Street. And it runs parallel to, way down the end, it runs parallel to Route 24. And if you've ever walked it, it's a really nice walk in the fall. It's all swamp on both sides, but I've asked a number of people, how did that street get there? Why is it there? Why does it exist? And it shows up on a lot of the early maps. It was obviously made with a tremendous amount of fill, and some people say, well, it was just to access the wood in the swamp in the wintertime. So I think that's something that could be looked into in the future. Try to find some records on that. It would be really neat. Another shot of West Bridgewater, and this is just a bigger shot of the one I just showed you, and it shows the Ash Street coming all the way down. Ash Street's over here, but it was when Main Street was straightened out and so forth, and it's penciled in from the center up through up to Cochise. Major roads through town in 1700. There were a few bridges. In the early days, the easiest way to cross the river would be to throw a bunch of flat rocks in the river and create a ford. Eventually bridges were built over it. But the easiest way to cross them would be a ford. North Street, West Paris. And the next slide, I actually drew in some of the roads and how they've been straightened out or added to over the years. This is where they straightened out the road up in North Main Street. And right now you can go from West Bridgewater Center out, crossing the stream, and Market Basket will be up in this area. But they added these roads, straightened these roads out when they had more material to fill in the swamps and so forth. Another real important thing for the development of any town is the railroad. This is Cochise Station. I think one of the major reasons West Bridgewater didn't develop is the railroad didn't come through West Bridgewater. You did have a station, but you had two of them. You had the main station over by where Turner Steel is, and then you had Cochise Station right there. But it was a spur line that connected the old Colony line to the Taunton line, and it went across the center of town. Although the railroad was there, it was good for picking up produce and so forth, for grain and agricultural products and so forth, and for the limited manufacturing that was still done in town. But it only ran about 6 runs a day, whereas the other lines, the old Colony line from Boston down to Fall River, ran 30 or more trains a day, as compared to 6 through the center of West Bridgewater. So that really cut down on the number of people who were not only bringing freight, but people lived here for farming, for agricultural. They didn't live here it wasn't a commuter town. You couldn't get on a train and go to the shoe factories down in Middleborough or the factories up in Brockton and so forth, because it would take you forever. I don't know what the schedule was like from Cochise Station or from the main West Bridgewater station, because you had to go out either way to get onto a north-south line. It was an east-west line. But in order to get out, obviously there weren't a lot of stations, weren't a lot of trains going in that direction. Bob Wood showed me a map recently, today as a matter of fact, that he recently had pieced together that shows the railroad line, the spur line, only going to about, they said they used to be able to see it part behind the old high school football field. You could see the rail line. But I can't find on the map where it connected from there up through Cochise. There are many streets and so forth, and usually when you want to build anywhere near an old rail line, there are a lot of regulations, federal and state, and they won't let you just get rid of an old rail line, at least not in the last 100 years. So I'm surprised to see so many houses being built in the area. But I think it's kind of neat that part of it does show up on the railroad line. Also in the area was a trolley. A lady came in today with a picture of the trolley in Elm Square. I've got a map of the trolley line in 1900. Trolley started running in 1897. They came from Brockton down 28 through Bridgewater, West Bridgewater. And they came down Route 138 in Taunton. On my map, it doesn't show any trolley line going from West Bridgewater Center over to the 138 stations. But this picture obviously shows that they were there. I think when you look into the history of the trolley, it's fascinating in that it only ran for 30 years. Tremendous infrastructure went into building this trolley system. The tracks, there was a lot of fighting with the towns as to where the tracks are going to go. And obviously the trolleys went on roads, but you can see this trolley heading down to Taunton, and it's on a dirt road. Power stations everywhere because they ran on DC power. So you couldn't transmit DC power over a long length. I don't know where the electric generating stations were in West Bridgewater. There was a trolley barn in West Bridgewater on South Main Street, right at the Bridgewater line. There was a trolley barn there. I'm told there's a picture of that barn in the possession of a resident of West Bridgewater, and she won't part with it. I hope someday it surfaces because I think it's a valuable part of West Bridgewater history. But the trolleys ran, and it opened up the town to the construction of homes and so forth, because now people can go to Brockton to work in the factories. They can go to Bridgewater, Middleborough, and so forth. So it opened up a lot of possibilities. Another big thing in town are your churches. The first church, obviously, 1658 in West Bridgewater. I was very surprised to see how early the Baptist church was in West Bridgewater. I didn't imagine. I'm not familiar with the with Baptist church history and so forth, but I thought it was something that came along early to mid 1800s. I know in Bridgewater it did, but the Baptist church in West Bridgewater, and I believe they started up in the west end of town, up in Cochise. That's where they got started, and eventually they migrated down to the other side of Main Street, North Main Street, and eventually building their new church up on, it'd be North Elm Street. So the Methodist Church, the Cochise Church today, the Catholic Church, obviously in 1928. Before then, the Catholics in West Bridgewater attended church in Brockton or Bridgewater. Little story about the Methodist Church. That building is blessed. I saw something up there one day that I don't know why it happened, but when I was a building inspector in Bridgewater, the building inspector in West Bridgewater called me up and he said, "David, can you come up to the Cochise Church, meet me up there Friday afternoon?" So I met him up there about 2 o'clock, and he took me down into the basement area, the dining hall, and a couple of the ceiling tiles had fallen on the floor. Come on over here and look at this. And one of the major structural beams that hold the floor in the sanctuary had dropped down about a foot, and it was broken. It was literally cracked right through. And he said, they got a big function they want to do. Well, obviously, this is Friday. They want to use it on Sunday. And I said, well, obviously you can't do this. He said, well, I'm having a hard time telling them this because they just had a major function here this past weekend. And why this floor never collapsed, it's amazing, because the beam was just gone. So we ended up having a company come in, and they put in some structural staging. They jacked the beam back up, and over a period of time, I don't know if anybody's a member of the church here, but they had some major repairs done to that floor. But why that floor never collapsed with those people on it, it would have been a major catastrophe to the people worshiping in that church that day.
Dave, one other thing to add to that, that church was originally the second floor, was the first floor.
Oh,
From what I understand, they raised that and put the first floor underneath it.
yeah,
So
Yeah.
that would have been the basement.
yeah,
lower level floor.
yeah. So it's a little bit of strange history about the building. But churches, I believe it's Ben Spencer's book over there. He talks about law and order. When I picked it up, when he sent me a copy of it when he first came out, and I thought, well, this is great, because my dad, my grandfather was chief of police of Bridgewater for about 30 years in Bridgewater, and I thought, this is going to have a lot of stuff in it. But I started looking at it, and he goes back to day one with the church in West Bridgewater, or Bridgewater, Old Bridgewater, and reading through the things that went on and how they were handled in town, all I could think of was the stories you hear about the religious extremists, the Taliban, and so forth, and the things. The church was government in the early Plymouth County, early Plymouth colony. Everything except for capital crimes was handled in the local churches, or in this case, the First Church. And then you read about, in his book, you read about the things that were going on. It was like reading the Brockton Enterprise. The exact same problems. Breaking and entering and infidelity in marriages and so forth. And there was even a story about a man who was, if you were caught doing something wrong, you had to appear before the church deacons. And you had to plead your guilt and so forth if you were found guilty, or if you wanted to repent for your sins, it was either a fine or lashes. And there was a man who was coming to church dressed as a woman. So gender issues were an issue back in the early 1600s also. It's nothing new, folks. And he had to plead his guilt to the church, and he was punished. I think most people took the fines rather than the lashes. But it was that way up until the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, the Constitution separated church and state. And so over the next 40 years, the church slowly got out of the law enforcement business, and everything was handled by the towns, and more so with the county. But it was pretty interesting. But Ben's book, it's a great read. It's really neat. And like I said, it's over there on the rack. And there's other ones you can get online. Schools were another issue in the growth of a town. I've read that there were 8 small schoolhouses in West Bridgewater at the high point of education in town. And one thing about schools is that I once had a chance to talk to a man. He was a member of our historical commission, Alan Knight, and he attended the Auburn Street School in Bridgewater, which was a schoolhouse like this, a one-room schoolhouse. And he said that grades meant nothing. Age meant nothing. You were promoted by ability. And back then, most kids went up to about the 6th grade. And then you were given it, if your family had money and they could send you to a better school, Bridgewater Academy or Taunton, or I'm not familiar with any other ones in the area, but if you were going to increase your education, then you would move on and up. But the one-room schoolhouses were good up until about the 6th grade. One interesting fact about these one-room schoolhouses, I haven't looked into West Bridgewater history of the schools as much as I have Bridgewater, but they would move the school to the kids. They would literally pick up the building as parts of town developed and were settled, And if you had a lot of kids living over in, you know, up in the Cochise area, for example, they would literally pick up the building and move it up there, and it would be up there for 6, 8, 10 years or whatever, until the population moved or the kids moved on. So it was very common that these buildings were moved, and often the town wouldn't buy the land. The town would own the school, but they would just say, hey, can we put this on the corner of your field for a while? Yeah, no problem. Well, as time went on, these buildings, when they were no longer used as schools, they were converted into houses. And as building inspector, I ran into a lot of problems where somebody would be doing deed research on the house, and they would not be able to track the land back that far because it was part of somebody's farm, and then all of a sudden it's a house, but there's no proof of when the land was transferred to go along with the house, but it was just accepted and it was sold as time went on. Probably the most famous school in West Bridgewater is the Howard School, and you look at that building. It was huge. It was gigantic for a school in that area, and it was. In reading some of the stories about how big a part it was of the town, this was the first public high school. It was also the Howard Seminary, but the name Howard High School stayed on for many years, and there was a big fight in town in the 1950s as to when they were going to drop using Howard High School, and they kind of had a transition period where they had built the junior senior high. They didn't want to throw Howard out and take on West Bridgewater, so they kept junior senior high for a while. Bridgewater had the same problem with their academy. Many of the kids who graduated from Bridgewater High School are very proud of the diplomas because they said Bridgewater Academy. Well, it was the same way in West Bridgewater. A tremendous loss to the community when it burned in 1952. But just the size of that building, I think it must have been one of the largest buildings in the area, certainly bigger than anything on the Bridgewater State campus. But it must have been a beautiful building on the inside. Are there many pictures of the inside of that building in West Bridgewater floating around in the archives? Now, I've never seen any, and I was just curious. It must have been tremendous inside.
Is that where the high school is now?
No, further, more where the land where the library, the senior center, in that general area. Isn't the ground still elevated where the building used to be? Yeah, and the bell is there. Yeah?
High school, 2016, when she graduated.
You have your Howard diploma? Yeah. Source of,
The elementary school right next door to it is called the Howard School.
yeah. Still a source of pride for many people in town. Another one I was never aware of is the hospital, Dr. Leelashore. And unfortunately, the building didn't stand very long. It was only there for about 20 years. Started out as a maternity surgical hospital, and then eventually was converted to a sanatorium before it burned. I couldn't find any references to where in town was this.
Right up the street.
Right across the street?
Yeah, River and South Elm. Yeah.
River and South Elm?
Where the nice beautiful barn is now with the horses and,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Well,
you know,
very impressive building. So, and with every hospital, people pass in a hospital, and you have cemeteries. Now, you have a number of cemeteries in town that go back a lot longer than this. The Hillside Cemetery, I'm focusing on this one because some of you, anybody in here aware of tin gravestones?
Yeah.
Yeah, some people have heard of them. Okay, this is a tin gravestone, and there are a number of them. This is one of the biggest collection in the area of tin gravestones. Actually, the more appropriate name for them is white bronze, and they're made of zinc, cast zinc. And they came in two pieces, and they were, if you bought one, you bought the gravestone, and then you had a plaque made with your family information on it right here. and if there was a name cast in the bottom of it, you could have that made too. But those plaques are attached, they're bolted to the gravestone.
For those of us that don't know, where's that located?
Where is that located? That's located go up West Center Street. I believe the address is Pleasant Street. But you go you take a left into the park, and you go over the highway, a left where the park and ride facility is, and you continue around to the left like you were going to cross over the highway again. And when you get down to the end of the street, there's a right turn, and you go up in there, and it's kind of hidden. But there's a number of those gravestones up there, and they're beautiful. And you can tell them very easily because they don't have any lichen or any moss growing on them, whereas you have moss growing on the marble and the granite and so forth. So it's take a look at them. I only know of one stone like this in Bridgewater, and I know of one in North Middleborough. But West Bridgewater has a very nice collection of them, and they seem to be holding up very well. And what happened with those, why you don't see more of them, the industry, it ran for about 30 years, the company that was making them. There probably more than one company in the country, but World War I came along, and there was a shortage of zinc. It was rationed. So they couldn't use it for gravestones anymore. So that killed the industry. And after the war was over and zinc was available, it never came back. So many of these gravestones are well over 100 years old, and they're in excellent condition. They look like they're weathering.
Aren't they hollow?
Yes, they're hollow.
You can tap them, they're really
Yep.
not weird.
Yep.
There's a bunch of them in Mansfield too.
And where?
Mansfield.
Mansfield?
Is that from the stove company that made them at the time?
I don't know.
It made a lot of the graves up, that was in town.
Mason made a lot of them? They made a lot of locomotives down there too, didn't they? Yeah. I haven't found where the manufacturer was, but I think they're just really, really neat. Some of them are very fancy, and some of them are less fancy. And they've even got the small ones for the children and so forth. They're really neat to look at.
I have a question.
Yes?
Is that also Pleasant Hill Cemetery? Hillside, is that one and the same?
I don't know. Pleasant Hill and not Hillside? Okay. Well, it's off of Pleasant Street anyways. It's up in that end of town, up just past Cochise. But take a look at it some. It's a really, really nice display. And another interesting, my last little tidbit. Some people have heard of Sacco and Vanzetti. And I always like little things that associate Bridgewater or West Bridgewater, East Bridgewater with national and international politics. Now, obviously, Sacco and Vanzetti were in the area. They lived locally. They had a foiled robbery attempt in Bridgewater. I once had a chance to meet Robert White, and his father was L.Q. White, who had the big, huge shoe factory in Bridgewater. And he remembered as a young child the armed guard that his dad had to have at their house in Marshfield because Sacco and Vanzetti had tried to rob his company, and they had to go to court and testify. So they were involved in the trial and so forth. My grandfather was called in as chief of police at the time. He wasn't chief at the time of the foiled robbery, but because the trial took a number of years. But anyways, how it connects to West Bridgewater. At that time period, there was a real nasty period in American history. The anarchists, political movement was very anti-government. And if you ever read the book about the Great Molasses spill in Boston, they talk about the trial afterwards and how they were trying to connect that with the anarchist movement. And it wasn't, the company was trying to say they weren't responsible. But, yeah, my opinion is, I think they were, because it was a shoddy construction when they built the tank. But they were trying to claim that the anarchists, it was a bomb that caused the molasses spill. But anyways, Sacramento and Vanzetti, goes back to them. They picked up a car in West Bridgewater that they used for the robberies and so forth. And there was a family, I don't remember the name of it, but they were involved in all they did is just, Sacramento and Vanzetti picked up the car here in West Bridgewater, but there was a bombing in West Bridgewater. But that was very common for the time. In reading the trial, they talk about the anarchist terrorism that went on in the United States. And a little bombing in West Bridgewater, that was nothing. They had a car bomb on Wall Street. There was a police station in Boston that was bombed. The judge in the trial, I don't know whether it was his wife or one of his servants, opened a package and she lost her hands with a bomb explosion. So car bombs and bombings and political unrest right here in West Bridgewater. Nobody was hurt in the bombing in West Bridgewater, but it happened. So it's all related. The Ames family went on to make millions, and reading about them, it's both the good and the bad. They did a lot of things that are not allowed today, as far as government contracts going to politicians' families and so forth. The Ames family, they were very active in politics and so forth. So it's little old West Bridgewater had a big part in American history. So that's it for today.